you've already been sworn. Could you go ahead and state your name and position with the police department?
Yes, ma'am. Gary Aguirre, Bossier City Police Department, Sergeant, Internal Affairs.
How long have you been employed with the police department?
18 years and 7 months.
How long have you been with the Internal Affairs Department?
Since October of 2010.
On June 15th, you interviewed Corporal Hawkins, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to show you what I'm marking as Hawkins form. Do you recognize this form?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Is that the Garrity form that you had Officer Hawkins sign?
Yes, ma'am.
I'd offer this into evidence as Hawkins form.
That's the waiver of guarantee rights?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I have to say.
Sergeant Aguirre, if anywhere on that form does it explain to Officer Hawkins that he has a right to have an attorney with him while you're questioning him?
No, ma'am. It states he is entitled to the rights, privileges guaranteed by City Ordinance 96, 1984, Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights.
Does it reference the Louisiana revised statute also?
No, ma'am, it does not.
You understand that he's still protected by the Louisiana revised statutes, rules regarding the policeman's officer's Bill of Rights?
Yes, ma'am.
And under those Bill of Rights, you're aware that he's entitled to have an attorney present when he's interviewed?
I understand.
And you never advised Officer Hawkins that he had a right to have a counsel with him when you questioned him?
I did not tell him specifically, no, ma'am. I asked him if he understood his rights, his internal warning rights, and his Garrity rights.
Well, didn't you just ask me if you understood his Garrity rights?
Correct, yes, ma'am.
You didn't ask me if you understood his rights under the Policeman's Bill of Acts, did you?
No, ma'am, I did not specifically state that.
And when you started that interview with Corporal Hawkins, you identified the date and time, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And you told him his Garrity rights and asked him if he understood his Garrity rights, correct?
Correct.
And then you told him we're going to be speaking in reference to Internal Affairs case number 11-IA-0031.
Yes, ma'am.
That's going to be an incident on Walker Road on June 9th, 2011?
Correct.
Can you tell me about your involvement of that, correct?
Yes, ma'am, and I gave him also a time.
In 1300?
Yes, ma'am.
At any point before you started questioning him, did you tell Officer Hawkins that that complaint had been filed against him?
No, ma'am.
At any point, did you tell him what rules or code of conduct or general orders the complaint suggested he may have violated?
No, ma'am.
Did you ever tell him the content? You never told him the contents of the complaint?
No, ma'am.
You never offered to allow him to read the complaint, did you?
No, ma'am.
But the complaint had already been drafted, correct?
The informal complaint, the one that was forwarded to me, yes, ma'am.
And you actually had it in your possession because you signed on that complaint on June 13th, right?
That is correct.
Okay. So you had the complaint, right?
Yes, ma'am.
But you never offered to Officer Hawkins the right to read it, did you?
No, ma'am, it's not required.
Oh, it's not? Okay, let's talk about that. I had a little sheet going with my numbers and I'm sorry. Could you tell me what my next number is because I've lost my number 5? I'm going to show you what I've marked as Exhibit Hawkins 5. Do you recognize that document?
Yes, ma'am.
And that's General Order 0012 regarding complaint procedure and discipline misconduct and investigations of the same, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you're an investigating, right now your job title basically is investigating officer for IA, that's what you're doing?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Turn to the 4th page, but it's Roman numeral 3, and then D, so it's the top of the 4th page. The general order that you're required to follow this general order when you're doing your investigations, since you're the investigating officer, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And so the general orders, which you're required to follow during this investigation, provides that investigating officers shall ensure that prior to interviewing an officer of an alleged rules/regulation violation, the officer is informed of the complaint, to include the reading of the complaint if the officer desires. The officer reads and understands his Garrity rights, and the officer is informed of the findings of the investigation, right?
Correct.
But you didn't offer him the ability to read that complaint.
I did not offer him, no, ma'am.
You didn't even tell him it was a complaint against him, did you?
I did not tell him a specific complaint against him, no, ma'am, I did not.
And you never even, the whole time your interview, talked to him or showed him the towing policy that he allegedly violated, did you?
No, ma'am.
On about June 28th, were you provided a copy of the letter that I had written to Deputy Chief Jimmy Stewart requesting certain documents?
I will have to look back and review my files, ma'am, to see if I have it in my possession. To the 28th, ma'am?
June 28th, yes, sir.
Yes, ma'am, right here.
And in that letter on June 28th, I requested a copy of the recorded telephone conversation between Corporal Hawkins and Sergeant Gatos.
That is correct.
And on June 28th, you told me I couldn't have it, didn't you? Here, I'll show you a letter of a marked as Hawkins 6. Did you author that letter?
Yes, ma'am.
So on June 28th, prior to Corporal Hawkins' pre-disciplinary hearing, you advised that we couldn't have the tape. You said you weren't giving us anything other than the particular general order, which was public record. But if I issued a subpoena if discipline was opposed, the remaining items requested, I could do that, right?
I didn't specifically state in this letter. I'll read it per your request. In the follow-up letter sent to Deputy Chief Stewart stated June 28, 2011, in accordance with Louisiana Bride statutes, Officer's Bill of Rights, Corporal Hawkins is entitled to his recorded audio statements and transcriptions only. Also attached is BCB General Order, the one you requested, 05-10, provided to you by Louisiana Public Records Law. If any disciplinary action is taken against Corporal Hawkins by the chief, then its appeals process will begin with a subpoena. Dukas Tecum and may be issued for the remaining requested items.
But the only other items I requested in that letter, June 28th, you were providing, correct? So the only item you weren't providing was that radio conversation.
There was no audio. There was no telephone conversation to record.
You didn't say that though, didn't you, in the letter?
No, I didn't specifically state that. No, ma'am.
And aren't the telephones in the sergeant's office recorded?
No, ma'am.
When did y'all stop recording them?
Oh, that would be something I cannot answer.
Do you understand that at least when my client was a sergeant, he was under the impression that the phones in the sergeant's office were recorded?
I don't know what his impression was, ma'am.
What phones coming into the police department are recorded?
To my knowledge, the main lines coming into the front desk and dispatch in our corrections division.
Who would be able to answer that question for me, just would know that information?
I'm presuming the telephone people that work for the city. You mean specifically on when it was, if it was ever, is that what you were?
Right, I mean,
Okay.
he- I
No,
mean,
I
'cause
don't know.
That's what I'm trying to find, were those lines normally recorded
From
to
my
protect
knowledge,
sergeants from when people, citizens are calling in, that's where you're supposed to, one phones you should use if you're taking phone calls, you
No,
know?
ma'am, I don't know that's the answer to that question.
But at the time you responded to my request, you didn't tell me, oh, those lines aren't recorded, did you?
No, ma'am, I did state that in the letter.
But in response to the subpoena that I issued after the discipline, you told me none existed.
Right, when I get a detailed list of the requested one by one items that were, so I went through and double checked that each one was there. And
Who did you go check with about that phone?
I checked on our computer system.
Anything on the computer system? The computer system tells you which phone lines are recorded?
Well, we have a program, it's an internal separate program that you
Mhm.
can view. When you open up the icon, it has a recording system, just like some similar to the videos that you watched.
When you finished your investigation, or the first stage of your investigation, you prepared a report?
Yes, ma'am, my final draft, or this copy here is that you're referring to.
Yes, sir, and that's dated June 13th.
That's when I began my investigation.
When did you conclude your investigation?
Corporal Hawkins was, Mr. Hawkins was the last person I interviewed in this case, and that was on the 17th of June. So, with that being said, his transcription was transcribed on the 17th, so I'm gonna say the 18th to the 19th, roughly in that time frame.
The report that started on June 13th that you finished around the 17th, did you ever, except from response to discovery, did you ever provide a copy of this report to Corporal Hawkins?
The final one? No, ma'am.
You are aware that, I'm sorry, at the conclusion of your report, you determined that Sergeant England had violated the Bossier Code of Conduct, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
He was derelict in duty?
Yes, ma'am.